She testified against the cartel and trusted the badge to keep her safe through witness protection. But when the US Marshal reached the pier, he didn't hand her a new life. He pushed her into the freezing dark of the Chicago River. He didn't know that the city's most ruthless Irish boss had been trailing them from the shadows, waiting for his own moment to strike. Kieran Malone didn't come to the docks to save a witness. He came to find a ghost. But as the river claimed her, he realized she wasn't his enemy. She was his only way to finish the war. The storm over the Chicago docks that night was a jagged, freezing blade. Sheets of rain hammered against the rusted shipping containers of the North Pier, turning the world into a blur of gray and salt. It was a dead quiet midnight, the kind of silence that usually preceded a funeral. The sedan's tires crunched over the gravel of the abandoned pier, the sound swallowed instantly by the roar of the wind. US Marshal Miller didn't look at Isla as he killed the engine. "Standard protocol, Reyes," he said, his voice as flat as the gray horizon. "We wait for the secondary unit, then move you to the safe house." Isla nodded, her fingers twisting the frayed hem of her Navy flight attendant blazer. The white silk scarf around her neck was already damp from the humidity, and her name badge felt heavy over her heart. She trusted the badge Miller wore. She had to. She had traded her identity for the promise of a quiet life, and Miller was the architect of that survival. "Wait here," Miller commanded, stepping out into the lashing rain. Isla watched him through the fogged window, his silhouette merging with the shadows of the containers. Then the rhythm of the night broke. Miller didn't look for a secondary unit. He checked his watch and nodded to the darkness. 3 figures materialized from the rain like ink bleeding into paper, men with the sharp, predatory stillness of the Navarro cartel. Isla's heart lunged against her ribs. She reached for the door handle, but the lock clicked shut from the outside. Miller turned back, his face illuminated by a flash of lightning. There was no remorse in his eyes, only the cold calculation of a man checking a ledger. The back door was ripped open. A heavy fist collided with Isla's temple, sending sparks dancing across her vision. Before the scream could leave her throat, a jagged length of rope was biting into her wrists, binding them tight against her spine. "The boss says the deep end is the quietest place for a witness," a voice rasped. They dragged her toward the edge of the pier, her heels scraping against the wet stone. Miller didn't watch. He was already walking back to the car, pocketing a thick envelope. With a coordinated heave, they tossed her into the black. The impact with the Chicago River was a physical blow. The water was an absolute, paralyzing zero. Bound and weighted by her uniform, Isla sank. The surface light shattered into silver shards above her before vanishing into a suffocating, oily black. The quiet of the deep was a lie. It was a roar of pressure in her ears and the fire of salt in her lungs. She fought the ropes until her movements became sluggish, her consciousness fraying at the edges like a dying candle. Then, the dark was interrupted. Rough, urgent hands caught her under the arms, hauling her upward with violent force. She broke the surface, only to be dragged onto the jagged rocks. Kieran Malone didn't look like a hero. He looked like a predator caught in a downpour. His dark hair was plastered to his forehead, and his white dress shirt was soaked through, the fabric clinging to the intricate floral tattoos that crawled up his neck, the mark of the Malone syndicate. He had followed them for 3 miles, planning to snatch a witness. He hadn't expected to witness a murder. With a strong jaw set in grim determination, he dropped to his knees. He didn't speak. He didn't offer comfort. With a practiced, clinical efficiency, he tilted Isla's head back, his fingers firm against her jaw to clear her airway. He leaned down and pressed his mouth to hers, not in a kiss, but in a visceral, desperate act of resuscitation. He forced air into her lungs, his own chest heaving with the effort. Isla's body convulsed. She retched, coughing up the brackish river water as her lungs screamed back to life. Kieran sat back on his heels, watching her breathe with a gaze that was heavy and dark. He didn't reach out to touch her again. He just looked at her as if she were a complicated problem he had just invited into his world. He didn't know yet how right he was. The silence was the first thing Isla noticed. It was a heavy, expensive kind of quiet that didn't exist in the cramped galleys of airplanes or the buzzing fluorescent hallways of the courthouse. She opened her eyes to a ceiling of dark, polished wood and the soft scent of rain-washed cedar. The bed beneath her was immense, the linens crisp and smelling faintly of a citrus-based detergent that felt entirely too civilized for a woman who had just been pulled from the bottom of a river. A movement in the periphery of the room drew her gaze. Kieran stood in the doorway, silhouetted against a dimly lit hallway. He had changed into a dry black sweater, His damp hair swept back, but the intensity in his eyes remained unchanged, watchful, distant, and utterly unreadable. "You're in my home," he said. His voice was a low, resonant baritone that seemed to vibrate in the still air. "You're safe. You're dry. And as far as the rest of the world is concerned, you're currently drifting toward the Atlantic." Isla tried to sit up, her muscles screaming in protest, the memory of the ropes still ghosting around her wrists. "Who are you?" she rasped, her throat raw from the salt and the screaming. "Kieran Malone." He said it simply, without ego, yet the name hit her with the weight of a physical blow. She had heard it before, murmurs between high-profile passengers in first class, a name whispered in the same breath as Untouchable and Syndicate. It was a name from a headline she had skimmed during a layover, a shadow that moved beneath the surface of the city's legitimate face. She looked at the man who had breathed life back into her and realized she had traded a corrupt lawman for a kingpin. He didn't wait for her to process the revelation. Without a word of comfort or an explanation of his motives, he turned and vanished into the hall, his footsteps silent on the deep pile carpet. When Isla finally managed to swing her legs out of bed, she found a small bundle waiting just outside the door. There was no note, just a neatly folded white dress shirt. It was one of his crisp, heavy cotton that felt cool against her skin. She picked it up, lingering on the texture for a long moment before sliding her arms into the sleeves. It was several sizes too large, the hem falling past her mid-thigh and the cuff swallowing her hands. She stood before a floor-to-ceiling mirror and began to roll up the sleeves with shaking fingers. The woman in the glass was pale, her eyes haunted by the dark water, but the oversized shirt acted like a suit of armor. In her flight attendant uniform, she had been a servant of the sky, a witness, a victim. But in this borrowed skin, the transformation was startling. She didn't recognize the woman looking back, but for the first time since the trial began, she didn't look like prey. For the next 2 days, Kieran remained a ghost in his own house. He was civil when they crossed paths, ensuring she was fed and tended to, but he kept a calculated distance. He hadn't decided what she was to him yet, a liability, an asset, or a second chance. He had saved her simply because he had found her, and now, they were both waiting to see what would happen when the silence finally broke. The third morning arrived with a clarity that felt like a sharpened blade. Isla sat at a plain, heavy oak table in the kitchen, the steam from a cup of black coffee curling into the air between her and Kieran. He didn't offer a morning greeting. Instead, he slid a burner phone across the scarred wood. "It's official," Kieran said. His voice was devoid of any particular softness, as if he were delivering a weather report rather than the obituary of her life. Marshal Miller filed his report. Witness Isla Reyes was lost during a high-speed transit incident. Drowning. They couldn't recover the body due to the storm conditions. Case closed. He paused, his dark eyes tracing the steam rising from his own cup. The Navarro cartel received the confirmation an hour ago. They've already moved their focus back to their distribution lines. As far as the law and the underworld are concerned, you no longer exist. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. Isla didn't move. She allowed the words to settle into her bones, feeling the strange, hollow weight of being a ghost. In that beat of silence, the life she had spent 28 years building flickered before her like a dying film reel. She thought of her studio apartment with the leaky faucet and the succulents that would now wither on the windowsill. She thought of her colleagues at the airline, the girls she'd shared coffee with during long layovers in London and Dubai. Then the sharpest sting, her mother. She could almost hear the knock on the door, see the somber tilt of a uniformed officer's head as he told her that her daughter had been lost to the river. The grief was a physical ache, a raw, jagged knot in her chest that made it hard to swallow. It is the funeral for a woman who did everything right and was still discarded like trash. But as the seconds ticked by, the grief began to be crowded out by something colder. Something hotter. Underneath the mourning, a flicker of iron ignited. The fear that had lived in the pit of her stomach since the day she'd witnessed that mid-flight execution was gone. Not because she was brave, but because there was nothing left for them to take. Isla looked up, her gaze meeting Kieran's. "Does that mean they've stopped looking for me?" Kieran leaned back, studying her with a renewed intensity. "They don't hunt for what they believe is at the bottom of the river. You're the only person in the city who can walk through their front door without them reaching for a gun." Isla nodded slowly, her fingers tightening around the warm ceramic of her mug. "Good," she said. She said it with a quiet, lethal finality that caused Kieran to go still. It wasn't the response of a victim relieved to be safe. It was the response of an architect who had just found the perfect site for a demolition. Isla Reyes was done trying to get her old life back. She was finally ready to decide what to do with the life she had left. The kitchen was filled with the low hum of a refrigerator and the rhythmic ticking of a clock, a stark contrast to the storm that had brought them together. Dinner was a sparse affair, pan-seared steak and roasted greens, prepared with the same clinical efficiency Kieran applied to everything else. He ate with a disciplined focus, a man who viewed food as fuel rather than a luxury. Isla watched him over the rim of her water glass. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was a shared space of observation. Finally, she set her glass down, the soft click echoing against the stone countertop. "Why did you do it?" she asked. Her voice was steady, devoid of the tremors that had plagued her 48 hours ago. "You were trailing Miller for a reason. You could have stayed in the shadows. Most men in your position would have let the river finish what the Marshal started." Kieran didn't look up immediately. He cut a precise piece of steak, his movements deliberate. "Most men aren't looking for the Navarro's throat," he said quietly. He set his fork down and leaned back, the dim light catching the edge of the floral tattoo on his neck. "I had a brother, Cormac. He was 21, bright, and far too trusting for this city." He spoke with no particular softness, but the air in the room seemed to grow heavier. The Navarro cartel recruited him to mule high-value shipments on a specific freight route. When the pressure got too high and Cormac became a liability, they didn't fire him. They disposed of him. They found him in the river 3 days later, his hands tied just like yours. That was 10 years ago. Kieran's gaze remained fixed on a point somewhere past her shoulder. "I've spent a decade building a shadow empire just to ensure I'm the last thing that family sees before they go under. I've been waiting for a crack in their foundation, an opening they couldn't see coming." Isla listened without interrupting, her flight attendant training, the art of observing without intruding, serving her well. She saw the flash of the raw, jagged grief he'd buried under layers of iron and Irish grit. She didn't offer platitudes or hollow sympathy. Instead, she let the weight of his story sit between them until it became a bridge. "The Navarros are creatures of habit," Kieran continued, his voice dropping an octave. "I've been watching the witness for months, Isla. I thought you were just a girl caught in the crossfire." She noticed it instantly, the way her name sounded in his mouth. He'd stopped calling her the witness. He didn't acknowledge the shift, and neither did she, but the invisible barrier between the protector and the protected had just thinned. Isla leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she connected the dots of her own career to his brother's ghost. "They didn't just use him for one route, Kieran. They used the same corridor twice. I know it because I flew it for 3 years. I know the shifts, the hangar blind spots, and exactly which cargo manifests never get audited." For the first time since she'd woken up in this house, Kieran looked up from his plate and met her eyes directly. The predatory stillness was gone, replaced by a sharp, calculating recognition. They were no longer two strangers sharing a meal. They were two survivors realized they had been circling the same wound from opposite sides, and only one of them held the map to the exit. The heavy double doors of the study remained slightly ajar, casting a warm sliver of light onto the hallway's dark floor. Isla didn't wait for an invitation. She walked toward the center of the room, where a massive topographical map of the Midwest and its international flight corridors lay spread across a mahogany table. Kieran was there, leaning against the doorframe, his sleeves rolled up to reveal the edges of the tattoos that mapped his own history. He didn't move as she approached the table, his silence an open invitation for her to see what he saw. Isla's eyes scanned the ink and coordinates, her mind automatically shifting into the clinical precision of a flight coordinator. She didn't see lines and dots. She saw altitudes, pressure systems, and the invisible highways of the sky. "You're looking at their ground distribution," Isla said, her voice cutting through the quiet of the room. She didn't look up, her finger already tracing a path from O'Hare toward the northern suburbs. "But the Navarros don't move the high-value weight by truck. They use the short-haul freight carriers." She began to point, her touch light but certain. "This corridor here, between Chicago and Detroit, it's a graveyard for oversight. Most regional cargo flights at 3 a.m. are barely audited. If you know the refueling schedule at this private hangar in Rockford, you have a 40-minute window where the tarmac is practically ghosted." As she spoke, her posture shifted. The lingering paleness of the river seemed to recede, replaced by a sharp, electric focus. She was back in her element, navigating the complexities of a system she had mastered over thousands of hours in the air. She detailed the blind spots in the radar handoffs and the specific tail numbers that always seemed to bypass the secondary inspections. Kieran didn't interrupt. He watched the way her eyes moved, the way her hands navigated his world with more confidence than his most seasoned lieutenants. He wasn't looking at the map anymore. He was looking at her, a man witnessing the exact moment a victim reclaimed her power. Isla felt the weight of his gaze and finally looked up. Her hand stayed pinned to a refueling hub in rural Illinois. Kieran didn't pull back. He met her stare with a dark, appreciative intensity that made the air in the room feel suddenly thin. For a long, suspended second, the map beneath them vanished. There was no cartel, no vendetta, no river, only the realization that they were perfectly matched in their pursuit of wreckage. Isla was the first to break the silence, turning her attention back to the ink. "The third vulnerability is their pilot rotation," she said, her voice slightly lower. "They use the same 3 contract flyers. They're predictable. And in the air, predictable is a death sentence." Kieran stepped forward, reaching out to slowly roll up the heavy paper, his knuckles brushing near hers. "You're going to be a problem for them," he said, his voice a low, rough promise. Isla straightened her borrowed shirt, meeting his eyes with a cold, clear light. "That's the idea." The morning sunlight filtered through the kitchen windows in pale, dusty shafts, a stark contrast to the neon-drenched violence of the previous nights. Kieran was already there, standing by the industrial espresso machine. He looked different in the early light, less like a specter of the underworld, and more like a man plagued by a restless mind. He was fumbling with the portafilter, his movements efficient but lacking the nuanced touch the machine required. Isla walked in, her feet silent on the cold tile. She was still half submerged in sleep, her mind a fog of jet lag and river-cold memories. She watched him for exactly 4 seconds. It was a visceral, involuntary twitch of her former life. She had spent thousands of hours perfecting the art of the perfect pour in pressurized cabins for men far more demanding than this one. Before she had fully registered the movement, she was stepping into his space. "You're burning the beans," she murmured. Kieran froze as she gently nudged his arm aside. She didn't wait for permission. Her hands moved with a rhythmic, hypnotic grace, adjusting the grind size with a practiced click, purging the steam wand, and tamping the grounds with a precise, level pressure. She watched the dark, syrupy liquid mousetail into the ceramic cups, the crema forming a perfect, golden hazelnut head. She slid a cup toward him and turned, only then realizing how close they were standing. Kieran was staring at her, his expression a mask of unreadable stillness. The silence in the kitchen stretched, thick and heavy with the sudden domesticity of the moment. Isla blinked, the fog finally clearing. That's how you're supposed to treat the roast," she stammered, her face warming. "Habit." Kieran didn't look away. He took the cup, his fingers brushing hers, and took a slow, deliberate sip. His face remained an iron wall, but something in his eyes shifted, a brief, flickering spark of surprise that quickly settled into a deep, quiet respect. "It's better," he said simply. He didn't offer a thank you, he didn't need to. He just turned and left the kitchen, the scent of high-altitude perfection lingering in his wake. It was the first truly normal moment they had shared, a brief ceasefire in a war that hadn't even started. Later that afternoon, the house's heavy atmosphere was punctured by Declan, a broad-shouldered man whose knuckles bore the scars of 1,000 brawls. He was rummaging through the pantry, looking visibly lost. Isla, passing through with a book, didn't even look up. "Top shelf, behind the flour, Declan," she said absent-mindedly. "And please close the cabinet properly this time. The hinge is delicate." Declan froze. He looked at the cabinet, then at the small woman in the oversized white shirt. Without a word of protest, he found the sugar, closed the door with the gentleness of a man handling a bomb, and retreated. He told the rest of the crew in the garage later that the ghost girl had a way of looking through you that made you want to straighten your tie. From that day on, the compound changed. The hardened men of the Malone syndicate became oddly, inexplicably polite, clearing pathways and lowering their voices when she entered a room. Declan, in particular, took to anticipating her needs with a silent, stoic devotion, as if being told to shut a cupboard by Isla Reyes was the highest promotion he'd ever received. The hangar at Rockford Regional was a cavern of corrugated steel and humming mercury vapor lights, smelling of jet fuel and cold grease. To the Navarro Guard stationed by the side-loading bay, it was just another midnight shipment. To Isla, it was a chessboard she had memorized over 1,000 flights. She stood in the shadows of the mezzanine, her fingers hovering over the screen of a tablet Kieran had provided. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs, but her hands were steady. This was her invisible infrastructure. She accessed the hangar's logistics hub, entering her old employee credentials. The system, unaware it was being commanded by a ghost, blinked green. With a few precise taps, she overrode the security sensors in Section 4 and froze the CCTV loops. "Electronic eyes are dark," she whispered into the comms. "You have 6 minutes before the automated system triggers a diagnostic reboot. Go." Below her, Kieran's men moved like smoke. They didn't use flashlights. They used the darkness Isla had created for them. While Declan and the crew breached the cargo hold of the short-haul Cessna, Isla worked the digital locks on the manifest database, deleting the flight's digital footprint in real time. She felt a surge of adrenaline as she watched the Navarro's encrypted tracking software spin in a futile circle, unable to ping a cargo that no longer officially existed. The shipment, millions in uncut narcotics hidden inside crates of aviation parts, was moved into Kieran's unmarked vans in under 4 minutes. It was a surgical strike, executed with the terrifying grace of a predator and the insider knowledge of a professional. The drive back was a low-lit sanctuary of leather and humming tires. The tension that had defined the last week hadn't vanished, but it had transformed into a shared, vibrating energy. They were two architects of a perfect heist. From the back seat, Declan let out a gruff, adrenaline-fueled huff. "I've done this 20 years, he muttered, "and I've never seen a gate open that fast without a crowbar. I think the ghost girl's got the devil in her thumbs." Isla let out a laugh, sharp, genuine, and unexpected. It was a bright, human sound that cut through the heavy, dark atmosphere of the SUV. She hadn't realized how much she'd missed the sound of her own joy until it spilled out of her, unbidden. Kieran's hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel. He glanced over at her, his dark eyes lingering on the way her face transformed when she smiled. He looked almost confused, the expression of a man who had lived in a world of shadows for so long he had forgotten what a real, untainted laugh sounded like. He saw the woman who had been a victim in the river and a witness in the box, and realized she was neither. She was alive, and she was dangerous. He didn't say anything to break the moment. He didn't have to, but as he turned the car toward the city, he didn't look away either. The shadow work began at 2 a.m., the hour when digital sins were easiest to exhume. Kieran's tech team had bypassed the encryption on Marshall Miller's private servers, and the data that spilled out was a portrait of a man who had long ago traded his soul for a retirement fund. Miller wasn't just a cartel asset, he was a double agent. He was auctioning off the Navarro's internal security protocols to a rival syndicate in Miami, playing both sides of the board to maximize a payout that would let him disappear into the ether by Friday. Kieran sat in his study, the blue light of the monitor deepening the hollows of his face. He saw the timeline and realized he couldn't wait for a slow burn. Without waking Isla, he authorized a ghost ping, a deliberate, traceable login using her dead airline credentials from a library in a suburb Miller monitored. It was a digital flare, a signal that the dead witness was suddenly surfacing. The bait worked with terrifying speed. By dawn, Miller had panicked, shifting his funds and moving to a secondary safe house, inadvertently exposing his entire financial network and his hidden departure flight. Isla found out while drinking her morning coffee. She saw the notification on the tablet, a log of her own name being used as a lure. She didn't scream. She didn't break the cup. She simply waited for Kieran to enter the kitchen. When he did, the air in the room didn't just chill, it solidified. Isla stood by the counter, her eyes 2 chips of frozen flint. "You used my name," she said, her voice a low, vibrating hum of controlled fury. "You put a target on a ghost." Kieran didn't flinch. He poured a glass of water, his movements as steady as they had been on the pier. It flushed him. "We have his offshore keys and his exit route. The risk was calculated." "I am not a calculation, Kieran." She stepped into his space, her presence small but absolute. "The marshal treated me like a line item in a ledger, and I ended up in the river. If you ever use me as a piece on your board without my consent, if you ever treat me as a variable instead of a partner, I will walk out that door. And I will finish the Navarro's and Miller myself. I've lived through drowning. I'm not afraid of the dark." The silence that followed was a physical weight, a high-tension wire stretched to the breaking point. Kieran looked down at her, seeing for the first time that the woman he had resuscitated didn't just have his breath in her lungs. She had his iron in her spine. A man like Kieran Malone didn't offer apologies. They were a currency he didn't possess. He held her gaze for a long, grueling beat before he spoke. It won't happen again. 4 words. They weren't a plea for forgiveness, but a solemn treaty. Isla searched his face, looking for the lie and finding only a hard, newfound respect. She nodded once, accepting the terms. Trust between a ghost and a kingpin wasn't a straight line, but in the silence of the kitchen, 4 words were enough to keep the foundation from cracking. The strategy was as sharp as the emerald silk Isla would now wear. They were going to the Drake Hotel, not to hide, they were going to haunt. Kieran called it a psychological flush. By appearing at Navarro's victory gala, they would force Marshal Miller to see that his dead witness was alive and backed by the city's most formidable Irishman. A panicked man makes mistakes, and they knew Miller would immediately scramble to move his offshore funds. Movements Kieran's tech team was poised to intercept. The preparation began in the compound's armory, where the scent of gun oil clashed with the sudden arrival of high-end silk. Kieran stood by a workbench, presenting the evening's disguise, a backless gown of emerald satin that looked more like liquid jewel than fabric. Absolutely not, Isla said, leaning against a crate of ammunition. It's a charity gala, Kieran, not a premiere. I need to be invisible, not the centerpiece of the room. Kieran held the dress up, his expression uncharacteristically dry. You're playing the part of a venture capitalist state. If you look like a librarian, they'll wonder why I'm with you. Wear the dress. I can look the part without catching pneumonia, she countered, crossing her arms. Across the room, Declan and 2 other men were meticulously cleaning their sidearms, their heads bowed in a sudden, intense focus that fooled no one. They were hanging on every word. When Isla turned her sharp gaze toward them for support, Declan accidentally made eye contact, panicked, and immediately began polishing the same spot on his barrel as if his life depended on it. Eventually, a compromise was reached. A sleek, floor-length black gown with a high neck and a daring slit, paired with a tailored blazer Kieran insisted on. Isla accepted it under vocal protest, though the way the fabric felt like a second skin suggested she knew exactly how powerful she looked. The tone shifted the moment they stepped into the Drake Hotel's ballroom. The air was thick with the scent of expensive lilies, and even more expensive lies. Kieran moved with the quiet, terrifying authority of a man who owned the shadows the guests tried to ignore. Isla, however, was the revelation. Years of managing volatile first-class passengers and navigating the rigid hierarchies of the sky had given her a practiced ease. She moved through the crowd not as a guest, but as a woman who had spent her life perfecting the art of being exactly what people expected to see. The tension spiked when a Navarro lieutenant drifted toward them. To seal their cover, Kieran stepped closer, his hand settling firmly at the small of Isla's back. Isla didn't stiffen. Instead, she leaned into him by instinct, a slight tilt that signaled to the room she was exactly where she belonged. Neither of them exhaled until the lieutenant passed. Even then, they didn't step apart. When they finally stepped apart, the air felt colder. Kieran's hand lingered a second too long before dropping. Then Isla saw him. Marshal Miller was standing near the champagne fountain, laughing at a joke told by the Navarro patriarch. Isla stepped into the light, letting the chandelier catch the diamond cut of her profile. Miller's gaze wandered toward them, then stopped. The laughter died in his throat. The color drained from his face until he was the same shade of gray as the river water that should have claimed her. He didn't see a witness. He saw a ghost in black silk, standing next to the man who was going to end him. The horror in his eyes was absolute, the realization that his loose end had just become his noose. The drive back was a hum of adrenaline. They had Miller's panic-coded location and his flight logs. But as the city lights blurred, the tactical debriefing died. Isla watched the streetlights through the glass. You never actually looked at Miller in there, she said quietly. Not once. Kieran kept his eyes on the road. No. She waited. I was looking at you. The confession hung in the dark, heavy and true. Isla didn't fill the space with small words. She reached across the console and took his hand, her fingers lacing into his. Kieran turned his hand over and held on. They didn't need a grand speech. Between a rain-soaked pier and a map traced by firelight, a pact had been made. Miller was running, but Isla was finally home. The operation was not a brawl, it was architecture. While Kieran's men moved across the city like shadows cutting through silk, Isla sat in the command center of the compound, her face illuminated by the cool glow of 3 monitors. She wasn't merely watching, she was rerouting the Navarro cartel's reality. With the precision she had once used to map international flight corridors, She diverted their encrypted distress signals to dead ends and locked their logistical hubs behind firewalls they didn't even know existed. Every variable was accounted for, every exit capped. She had built this takedown the way she used to build flight plans, ensuring that by the time the Navarro patriarch realized his empire was burning, the exits were already sealed. The culmination of the night didn't happen in a hail of gunfire, but in a small, dimly lit office at the edge of the docks. US Marshal Miller sat cornered against a desk, the sweat on his brow gleaming like oil. He looked at the door, hoping for a squad that wasn't coming, only to find Isla Reyes standing there. She wasn't wearing the emerald silk anymore, but a simple dark sweater, her presence filling the room with an unnerving, absolute calm. "The transfer you were waiting for isn't coming, Miller," she said, her voice steady and devoid of the tremors he remembered from the car. "Your offshore accounts have been drained, your flight plan has been cancelled, and the Navarros think you're the one who sold them out." She stepped closer, never raising her voice as she detailed the systematic dismantling of his life. Kieran stood by the door, his arms crossed, but he didn't intervene. He wasn't watching the traitor, he was watching Isla. He saw the way she stood, shoulders square, feet planted, a woman who had stripped away the skin of a victim to reveal the steel beneath. He realized then that he hadn't just saved a witness on that pier. He had resuscitated a force of nature that had simply been waiting for the right storm to wake up. Miller was led away by a federal contact Kieran had kept in reserve for a decade. A man who would ensure Miller went to a prison where the name Malone was law. Then the world went quiet. Back at the compound, the adrenaline began to bleed away, replaced by a heavy, profound stillness. Declan and the men filtered out into the night, leaving the two of them alone. Isla stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, her back to the room, watching the Chicago lights flicker through the lingering rain. The exhaustion was a physical weight now, pressing down on her after weeks of running, drowning, and rebuilding. "Isla." Kieran's voice was a low vibration that seemed to pull her back from the ledge of her own thoughts. She turned, her gaze meeting his. He crossed the room with the deliberateness of a man who had finished his war and was ready for his peace. When he reached her, he didn't hesitate. He took her face in his hands, the same hands that had forced life into her lungs on a wet rock, and kissed her. It wasn't an urgent, desperate act driven by the night's violence. It was slow and intentional, a decision they had both been circling since the moment she traced a map in his study, and neither had looked away. The kiss held the warmth of a sanctuary, a stark contrast to the freezing river and the cold betrayal of the law. They had both been hurt by the systems meant to protect them, holding themselves at arm's length out of a guarded, jagged history. But here, in the quiet of the finished operation, that distance finally dissolved. She kissed him back with the same steady resolve, choosing him just as he had chosen her. The air in the room felt different now, lighter, cleaner. The night they met, he had been the one providing her breath, a mechanical necessity to keep her heart beating. Tonight, standing in the center of the life they had reclaimed together, Isla was breathing freely on her own, the weight of the water finally gone for good. The early morning light was the color of pale honey, filtering through the heavy curtains of the master suite. Isla slipped out from beneath the sheets, her movements practiced and fluid, trying to leave the warmth of the bed without disturbing the man beside her. She failed. Before her feet even hit the floor, she felt the weight of his gaze. Kieran was already awake, propped up against the pillows, watching her with that dark, steady intensity that had once seemed predatory but now felt like an anchor. It was an expression the last few weeks had taught her to read, the silent language of a man who used his eyes to say everything he refused to put into words. There was no suspicion in his look, only a quiet, grounded recognition. "The first manifest for the London freighter is coming in," she murmured, pulling on a silk robe. "I want to verify the clearance codes before the ground crew arrives." Kieran said nothing. He simply watched her move through the room with the quiet ease of someone who truly belonged there. She wasn't a guest in his house anymore, nor was she the ghost of a witness hiding from a cartel. She moved with the confidence of a woman who had stopped asking for permission to take up space and had simply decided to own it. The air at the private airfield was crisp and smelled of dewy grass and jet fuel. Isla stood on the tarmac, a digital tablet in one hand and a physical manifest in the other. Towering behind her was a long-range transport plane, its silver fuselage gleaming in the rising sun. It was the flagship of a logistics empire that now spanned 4 continents. Cargo routes she understood better than anyone alive, blind spots she had personally mapped, and a system she had rebuilt from the ruins of her old life. She heard the rhythmic crunch of gravel behind her. She didn't turn, she didn't need to. She knew the cadence of his step as well as her own heartbeat. Kieran came to stand beside her, the wind catching his dark hair. The early light caught the sharp edge of her profile, illuminating the focus in her eyes as she cross-referenced the coordinates. Isla leaned into him, not the hesitant, half-lean of a woman testing the waters, but a full, certain weight against his chest. Kieran reached out, his arms settling around her shoulders as if it were the most natural thing he had ever done. For a man who had lived his life as a fortress, the gesture was a surrender of its own kind. They stood there in the clean silence of the morning, watching the horizon turn from purple to gold. Somewhere behind them, a life that had been stolen and dismantled was running with the precision of a high-altitude engine, exactly as its architect had intended. Isla wasn't checking tickets anymore. She wasn't running from shadows or waiting for a badge to save her. She wasn't the victim, the witness, or the prey. She was exactly where she had decided to be, and for the first time in his long, violent history, so was he. The sky had always belonged to her. Now, so did everything beneath it. If you enjoyed this story of love, betrayal, and impossible choices, don't forget to hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more heart-stopping love stories just like this. And hey, turn on the notification bell so you never miss the next twist of passion and suspense.